I've known Jerry Jones for a while. No, I'm not talking about that Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, but rather this Jerry Jones, who's far less famous, who has been a longtime expat for over a decade and a half. I first met him a few years ago at a Families in Global Transition conference where we hit it off immediately and ended up having some really great conversations around the expat experience. The awesome thing about him is that he's generally not afraid to have difficult discussions. Jerry, who is an intercultural consultant, spends much of his time helping expats transition and unpack whatever has unknowingly creeped into their proverbial suitcases as they navigate whatever international adventure has called them. As you can imagine, when you start talking to people about their stereotypes and assumptions, it can make for some uncomfortable discussions. On his own blog, Jerry has written about white expat privilege and racism, and we decided to continue the conversation here on the podcast. Jerry is the father of 2 adopted children of color, so for him, these aren't the topics you can really avoid. In this episode, we discuss the challenges he's seen new expats have when confronting their own bias, the difficulties of talking privilege with those who have it, and his sensitivity to discussing racial injustice with his own children as a white father. And I'll tell you now, it took us 2 episodes to do it, but it was completely worth it. Welcome to the Global Chatter. Jerry Jones, welcome to the Chatter. How are you?
Oh, man, I am so good. Thank you, Amanda, for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Man, I was thinking about, so I was washing dishes and I was thinking about how
That's
we
when
first
your
met.
best thinking comes. Yeah.
And I remember how we first met, and as all good things, it seems, families in global transitions.
Yep, that's right.
I've met a lot of people with FIGT, and I remember you coming up to me and you going, "The Black expat," and I remember laughing because shockingly, that's not the only time that happens to me.
I'm
and
sure.
My first thought is, my thought is, well, there are millions of them.
Yeah,
Millions.
right. But you are the Black expat. Right?
I am the only one in a planet of almost 7 billion people. And the funny part is, I was one then, but I am not one now.
Right. Define expat.
No,
right?
Well, we haven't listed on our website for anyone who's ever confused.
Right.
we have a whole definition, especially the I think the politicalness of the term. But but I remember. But what I do remember is that after that initial introduction, that I believe it was in the Netherlands, so I can't remember if it was The Hague or Amsterdam. I feel like it was The Hague. That we had this really good conversation, kind of following up in terms of the work that you do and so the stuff that I do with the Black expat, and so obviously that has led to a very entertaining yet amusing, I think, relationship since then. So
it's been good so far, and I'm looking forward to more. Yeah, me too.
So, all right. So for the people who don't know you, you are not a head football coach or owner.
None of that. But I do get his, I get like tweets and Facebook messages directed towards the real Jerry Jones often, especially when he's in hot water or he's done something big in the news.
Nice. I bet you get all the hate, so that's got to be wonderful.
Hate or love, like it's split right down the middle. They either love me or hate me. And
so, while you are not in football, I think it's important for folks who don't know you, for you to give a little bit of your backstory. And so, we are the Global Chatter, so we like to start at the beginning. So, where did you grow up, even though you're a seasoned expat? Where'd you grow up, and how'd you get overseas?
Yeah, I grew up in a cornfield in central Illinois, United States, right in the middle, very rural, very very monocultural, like extremely monocultural, and yet always had this thing in me that was driven towards global things. I remember dreaming about the world that I hadn't seen yet, and it seemed so far off and impossible. And then went to college, met a woman, got married, and she had been around the world a little bit. She had spent some time in, I think, in the Ukraine and Taiwan, and the two of us, after we were married, we were still in college, did a college internship in Taiwan, spent about 6 months there. And that's when I really got a taste for overseas life, and especially Asian culture, and really fell in love with it. And so then a few years later, we moved to China and spent most of the last 14 years there. Actually, just came out this summer. There was, in the middle of that, there was a repatriation and re-expatriate. I don't, you mentioned for people who are confused, I am among the people who are confused because I don't even know what to call myself at this point. So anyway, 2020 hit. We left China. We moved to Malta, which was big and exciting and new and going to be this great, amazing thing. And that lasted about 3 months. So we've had 2 international moves in 2020 of all years. And for right now, we're back in the States. We're kind of regrouping and figuring things out. But I like to consider myself a global person. I anticipate more interaction with the globe throughout the years, but it's a wild ride.
And so I think what's really cool is that, I was a TCK, so I grew up around folks who were always in flux and in moving. Right. I always think it's really interesting talking to folks who become expats, who they enter that world, but they didn't grow up that world as children, especially someone who's raising children. And so what do you think was really, I guess, because you especially do intercultural work, what do you think was really interesting that maybe you remember from your career, throughout your career, that you kind of noticed that was different as someone who grew up in one place, and then all of a sudden you're in this place where there's a lot of change, there's a lot of things different from the Midwest, I guess. Yeah, for sure. It's so interesting, the dynamic of transition and shifting from one thing to another. And a lot of times I catch myself speaking as if it is the normal experience, moving from one place and coming into another, and all of the feels, all of the big gaps and changes and challenges. And sometimes I forget, but there are people who've been doing this their entire lives. And the more I've worked with those people and worked in that world, in that space, there's such a diverse group of interactions with intercultural things, right? Like there's we're all processing this based on what we were packed with when we were young, and I've had I love to speak to like a group of people, and this is another reason I'm really sick of 2020 is because I really hate digital stuff. No offense right now. I'm enjoying talking to you, but I'd much rather be sitting in a coffee shop with you anywhere in the world and talking face to face. But I love a group of people who is right on the edge and just has no idea what to expect and is looking forward to that. And like those are my people. And I really enjoy working with them because there's so many questions and so much confusion. And I love to shed some light on that. And I also I love it when I have a group of those people and then a sprinkling of TCKs, people who have done this and are about to do it again, or, whatever the situation is. But because then I love playing one off the other and drawing from the wisdom of one side. And sometimes there's beautiful wisdom in the people who are just like deer in the headlights, right? Like sometimes people who have done this their whole life can really draw out some beautiful things from them because it's been so long, or it's been forever. Like they've never, or they don't remember those feelings. And there's some genius in there. There's some really great wisdom that comes out of everybody in the game.
And so I'm really curious because as you've described you coming from a monocultural background, in my mind, I'm like, this sounds like it's completely white bread. But,
Oh,
but,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
how does, then I guess what triggered your interest in doing intercultural work? And I think even for those who don't know what that is, can you sort of define what it is and why did you step into that in terms of as a profession and a career?
Yeah, for me, it's been kind of an evolution over my cross-cultural experience. And so went to China to really connect with Chinese people and started off teaching intercultural things. It was like a cross-cultural communication class with a group of Chinese professionals who were planning to work abroad. And I really loved that. Like that was really, really good. But as I continued to work, I really started to connect with the in China, we would call them foreigners, people like us who were coming in and working with those people. And then kind of through my work, got a contract where I worked with an organization and went around to, it was a group of international schools. And so I was hired to go in and kind of coach their staff as they would transition from their experience into China. And then that moved into the UAE, and that's opened the doors to a lot of other places. And I really loved it. Like I realized that I would love kind of it felt like an expansion of what I had come, because all of those people came with the same ideas and notions that I came in with. And I got to sit and unpack that and kind of unlock their experience. And I thought, if I can help these people do well, if I can help these people move through the initial stages and do their thing well, then that's even better than doing my thing well. And then that became my thing. I love that. And so I like my genuine hope, desire is to help other people do their cross-cultural thing better, and not, there's a lot of variables, a lot of dynamics that are connected to that. Like I want them not to screw it up, right? I want them not to fall apart. I want them not to mess up the culture that they're in and make the stupid mistakes that I've made and a lot of people have made. And I want them to stay longer. I want them to do better. And I get a lot of energy from that, from working with those people. And not that I don't love working with, like when I was in China, I still loved working with Chinese people. I think there's something about the Chinese personality that's a stereotype, but there's something really sweet and genuine, and I love crossing cultures. But I think even more, I love helping other people cross cultures.
What do you think you've seen has been some of the biggest challenges when folks stepped into a new culture? And I know, your particular experience has been predominantly in Asia, although I would imagine that your work, of course, can go cross-culturally depending the context or whatever in other spaces. But what have you noticed? And, whether it was you or some of the mistakes you made or just other folks when they step into a new place, especially when they're coming from a Western perspective.
Right. I think one of the big things is that people are really caught off guard because their preconceived notion of crossing cultures is, if I can understand this culture that I'm going into, then I'm good, I'm golden, I'm going to do well. And they just really get blindsided by the fact that they should have understood themselves a lot better. They didn't take into account who they were, who they are under stress, who they are as they engage some of the biases and stereotypes and a lot of times kind of deep down racial issues that they've never come to grips with get stirred up, and that gets uncovered in a cross-cultural situation. And so people actually come face to face with themselves a lot more than they do another culture. And if they can move past that part of it, then they're really set up to engage the other culture well. But if they don't, then it doesn't matter how much you understand China or the Middle East or sub-Saharan Africa, wherever you are, you can study those cultures all you want, and you've got good facts in your head. And it doesn't mean you're set up to do good. It doesn't mean that you're set up to not fall apart. And I think that's one of the big things that I've just noticed over and over and over again.
And so I'm wondering, as someone obviously who has traveled, I've traveled and done all the things.
You have traveled. That was the understatement of the podcast right there.
I have done some little travel here or there. But
have you ever flown on a plane?
I've been flying for so long. I try to remember,
right?
Side note, I try to remember the first time, maybe 2. Yeah. It could have been earlier, but 2, I think, is the most definitive I remember.
Yeah.
Or at least there was an event that I was around to that was and that was, that might have been international.
Wow.
So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't even domestic. That's the sad part. I don't even think I ever flew. I only flew domestic to fly international. Real talk. I know this sounds bougie as all get out. Yeah. To get to the real flight, my first solo flight as an individual was 12 international by myself.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And so, yeah. But this is not about me, although Mine
was 18. I was 18, and it was a flight from St. Louis to Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was about an hour flight, and it was the highlight of my life at that point.
I flew from sub-Saharan Africa to the States with a nice shout out to Lufthansa though, because Lufthansa had this great I don't know if it's a secret place. I don't even know if it's a thing anymore because obviously I'm an adult. But for kids who are unaccompanied who are flying,
right,
it was almost like this little Disneyland. So there was a spot in Frankfurt Airport where it was like food and games, and it was like maybe Willy Wonka's chocolate factory in the sense that it was all these kids without parents with airline staff who were watching them.
Great.
And then they would call you, and you had this thing, this little bag or satchel that had your ticket and all your information, your passport, and they would call your name and escort you to your
flight.
Outstanding. So that's
my dream childhood. I used to, I didn't know it existed when I was 12, but if you would have sold that to me, I would have jumped. I would have loved it. Oh.
And I flew from Africa to North America by myself.
Wow.
So,
I love it.
Yeah. So I can get around a lot of places and a lot of airports. But I was going to ask you, as someone who, let's just be honest, we've all experienced some kind of stress, doing this thing, some kind of stress, right? That says the guy who moved 2 countries in the middle of the worst pandemic.
I'm just trying to catch up. Yep.
But I think anyone who moved anywhere across borders this year was braver than, most of the people I know who did it didn't have a choice, but it was braver than anyone else I know. But, one of the things I think I always have conversations with is that, and I think this kind of speaks to your point, is that you can study, you can read, you can think, you can understand. And even if you're in the case of being an underrepresented minority yourself in whatever community you're in, it does not necessarily mean you also know the experiences of the people you're stepping into the space that you're going to.
Absolutely.
And I always fear that sometimes, and this is all of us, we can make all kinds of assumptions, right? All kinds of assumptions about what it is to be in a space, because once again, our perspective a lot of times depends on where we're sitting.
Right,
where we've been sitting informs how we see the world. And so
absolutely.
I think many of us sort of set ourselves up for a little bit of failure, if not catastrophe, because we step in and go, well, I already know because I've had these experiences or I've read these experiences.
Yeah. So much. There's that gap, and we fill that gap with whatever we have, whatever we can come up with. We try to educate ourselves, but that's a conversation that I have a lot. Is like not knowing is not the problem, right? Ignorance gets a bad rap, but ignorance is just not knowing. But as long as you're in the space of confessing your ignorance and realizing it and embracing it, then you're set up to ask questions. But when you go in and you've read Lonely Planet, or you've YouTubed the culture that you're going to, you've binged on whatever you can, and you think you've got it figured out, then you are set up for disaster, because you go in and you're the expert already, and come to find out you didn't know all you thought you knew. And those are the people that fall apart. Those are the people that I look for coming in. The people who are like, yeah, I'm here to save this place. I can fix this. I noticed that they do this, and like, what, you're going to fix Chinese traffic, right? Like you're going to overcome thousands of years of culture because you finally arrived. Those are the people who really, really not only fall apart, but do damage as they pass through. And so ignorance is not a bad thing. It's when you don't realize that you're ignorant. That's where it all comes from, right? Like that's at the heart of racism and ethnocentrism and all of the bad things that we typically attach to ignorant. Well, that person is so ignorant. We're all ignorant. It's just, do you know it or not? That's where it all comes down to.
And do you want to do something about it?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Right.
Because, yeah. And because you definitely touched on, these are conversations I have all the time, right? Obviously, we are both holders of Western passports.
Yep.
We have both lived in countries that are non-Western. We already know, at least for those of us who choose to be aware, that there is a historical and there's a lot of deep tension and a lot of just deep wounds there from when you look from a Western history standpoint, you look at an Eastern or a Southern history standpoint, when you look at, and then of course you add sort of the racial component, which is honestly a big component, especially when you're looking at non-Western communities. And so one of the things that we are looking at 2021, but one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I was thinking about you coming on, was thinking about a piece that you actually wrote, which is almost a year ago.
Yeah.
And and there are a couple of things. I remember you had sent me an email before it was published that you said, hey, just so you know, I mentioned the Black expat in it. And I'm pretty sure I was highly busy. So I was just like, whatever, it's fine. It's cool. Like, and I would have said no. I was like, that's good. And then I started to get all this traffic, God bless folks, from white people. And I was trying to figure out where all these white people, and unless anyone hears me and feels some type of way, the Black expat has always had non-Black readers, non-Black members, who are part of the audience, because there's nothing to hide. The information is a conversation, and it's raising visibility.
And it's so good.
Right. So I'm completely cool with the fact that people who don't have a Black identity are reading the site. Right. That's cool. In fact, that's important. Right. It's
so important for us, right? Like it's such a good conversation. Yeah.
Right. For everyone's, there's a different reason for every group who reads it, why it's important.
Right. Yeah.
But when you run a site called the Black Expat, and then you get an influx of white folks, like an influx, like in social media and other places. And this was before George Floyd, right? So we didn't even know what 2020 was going to look like.
Yeah.
I was like, where are all these people coming from? And so, if you run a website, you can see the back end. And it was like this piece called White Expat Privilege. And I went, oh, I should probably read that. so I did. First of all, I was like, okay, this is Jerry's site, so I'm good. Good. This isn't a hit piece from somewhere.
I cannot. I'd be good with that too. I can't vouch for the people who come to your site through mine, but I could at least be like, well, the person who wrote it, he's in good faith. I'm good. Right.
And so, because I think I told you, well, anyway, this is a later point, but I obviously followed the back end of my site. I got to your site and I read it and I thought, well, this has got to be one of the few pieces that I've seen that very explicitly talks about white expat privilege, because, as someone I've been doing a lot of speaking lately, and as someone who obviously I was a TCK in Sub-Saharan Africa, went to international schools. And the thing that I always say is real funny is that sometimes we sell this expat life, especially in the tighter circles, as this whole kumbaya, we all get along, especially in the international schools or like a model UN. And I'm like, yeah, but people fight in the UN. I don't know why we're saying that's what we are. Like, people have nationalistic ideas and ideas about who they are and identity. And so one of the things that I've, and this is part of the reason why the Black expat exists, is that there's always been, I feel, this challenge to address truly that there is a privilege, and there is a privilege that is tied to a lot of things, but a lot of it is race, passport, ethnicity, class.
Yeah.
Like those
absolutely.
are there.
Absolutely.
And so I am curious, from your point, what was sort of your motivation and kind of the response to you writing this piece?
Yeah. For me, it's again, all part of this journey that I'm on, because the place that I come from, excuse me. I think not only typically, very stereotypically, doesn't recognize the privilege that we have, but also it gets caught up in the broader narrative of the racial conversation. And because all of this is unfolding on a huge scale, on a huge stage, and there's so much kind of vitriolic, there's just a lot of pain, right? Like there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of fighting, and people who are just living their lives in their kind of in their herd, right? In their group. Not only do they not recognize the privilege that they have, but they get really upset when it's brought up, because it feels like the exact same thing as racism, right? Like the word privilege feels like an attack, and racism in itself, it's like they haven't recognized their racism either. And I've talked about that some, and that's been like when you step out of your herd and you go and you mix among the other animals, you learn things about your herd, and you learn things about yourself, and you learn things about a lot of things that you didn't have access to before. And sometimes that's really hard, that's really painful, but it has to start with just a recognition of what the realities are. And so for me, it was unpacking what was inside of myself, more than pointing a finger, more than trying to uncover anything in anybody else, more than jumping into the debate back and forth. It was just saying, yeah, like, I am so privileged, and I have to recognize that, and I have to say it out loud. That's not the same thing as I am racist. That's a different conversation. But probably it opens the door to discover maybe I'm some of that too, right? Like I've got lots of issues that were packed into me from my early formative years. And for me, it was never outright. It was never blatant. So it's nuanced, and it's harder you got to dig a little bit deeper to recognize, oh, there's some stuff in there that I don't like. But the very first step is to say, I have access to a lot of things that people don't have access to because of where I was born and the color of my skin. And there's so many things that have given me privilege. And for me to keep denying that just closes down the conversation and makes this whole thing worse. And so that's what I was trying to unpack in that. Yeah. I
was real curious. Are there, just from, and we'll get into your family in a second, but have there been instances, there's where I'm going, that you can remember very explicitly in your years that you've been abroad, that you could pretty much point out and say, there's a privilege that I have. That's why that happened to my benefit.
I had one. This one jumps out. I had this recently. Was standing in Malta at the Visa Services office and was trying to get some resolution on what we were going to do next. And it was kind of a like it was a crunch time. Our time was running out. We had to make a decision. Are we going to stay? Are we going to go? I was stressed out and understandably so. But I went to this office and I got in line, and I was very clearly the only well, I was the only white person in the line. Most of the people in the line had come to Malta to work in the service industry. They were, I can't be presumptuous about who all of them were, but I stood out. And as the person came through the line, it was her job to kind of filter down the line, and so she was. I don't know what the right word is, abrasive, or she was good at her job, but to me, she was just mean. Yeah. Like she was just coming through and kind of talking very loudly, very abrasively to people. And then she got to me and she stopped and she was still abrasive. She was still very direct. And I didn't end up with any extra access, but I got access to her. Like she stopped and she talked to me and she asked me where I'm from. And she spent so much more time on me than she did anybody else in the line. Mm-hmm. And it really jumped out to me as this experience like that would not have happened apart from the color of my skin and the stamp on my passport. Right. Like that was, and that's a small one. And I think, living in China, and there's always this, where are you from? And, oh, America, very good. And we would have that conversation. And I think my son is, both my children are adopted. My daughter's Chinese. My son is Black. And watching the difference between the interaction that China had with me and my children was powerful. For my daughter, it was, who's your mother? Who's your father? She would point to us and they would say, oh, that's impossible. Your hair is so black. You look like a Chinese girl. Aren't you Chinese? And how's she supposed to answer that? Like when she's 3 years old, how's she supposed to, well, yeah, I'm kind of Chinese, but I'm kind of not. And then we would get lots of, like, we would get into a taxi and we would say, hey, ni hao, which is hello. And they would say, whoa, your Chinese is so good. And then they would talk to my daughter and her Chinese was better than ours. And they would give her a hard time because she didn't speak Chinese at all. And so it was like, okay, you don't really mean my Chinese is so good. You just mean it's good for the white guy. And you're giving me the privilege of, and that's a huge thing. Like that initial interaction that you have with a culture that you're crossing into, how polite they are, how friendly, how accommodating you are, how hospitable, like that changes the whole experience. And so I watched her have that experience. But then my son also, like, is this your son? Yeah, this is my son. That's impossible. He's too Black. And then there were kind of questions, and there was always a presumption or an assumption about who he was or where he came from that they had to work through, and that's on them, but they had to work through their stereotypes and assumptions. And it really showed me that we don't all have the same experience. Being an expat is not the same thing for every person. So that was a really powerful experience.
And I think that's fascinating, right? Because you and your wife are obviously in a situation where both of you are white, your kids are children of color, and they are different ethnicities from each other. Right. And so I think you, someone who is a white male, you can actually see this play out in your own family. Like this isn't, hypothetical, I'm reading it or whatever. I'm actually seeing this happen. Right. I'm curious though, before we even get to that part, did you get any, or did you feel any pushback against when you were writing about white expat privilege, or even when you talk about it? Do you ever get folks who are like, but... like a little bit. And just as a disclaimer, my audience is not so huge that I'm out there in that space that it goes into the place where all of the fighting and the big stuff happens. But I get a little bit of pushback. For me, it's more on the personal front, the personal conversations and the interactions with people where I come from, and especially in a monocultural space, there's this misunderstanding, I think, of what
all of those issues really mean. And so it leads to some good, heartfelt conversations. Sometimes there's just a complete shutting down of because they have felt attacked by words like privilege. And so it leads to an honest conversation about how can you possibly deny the reality of privilege, right? You have access to a lot of things that people don't have access to. And I can't see how that's not privilege. And then from there, let's talk about the other stuff, right?
I think privilege is a really interesting word, and you're right. Folks kind of get bent out of shape over it, but I don't know. I mean, I think I am old enough and have lived long enough and thought about it long enough to realize there are just some things that you had that you are a beneficiary that you didn't necessarily work for. Some stuff you did, some stuff you didn't, right? So if you are, if you talk about being able-bodied.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I think sometimes too, because people have such a narrow view of what privilege is.
Yeah.
But if you think about just, okay, you're able-bodied, you don't have any health ailments, you don't have any issues, you're freaking privileged.
Oh, unbelievably so. Just going to the store is a privilege, right? Like
and this is, I'm speaking as someone who has a sibling who is physically and mentally has disabilities and challenges. You haven't lived until you figured out you have to map out going to say you're going on vacation, having to map out navigating a wheelchair.
Yeah,
through those places.
Oh my, yeah. Right? And this is what I love. What I love about what you're doing is kind of bringing the complexity of things like that out. Because when it only stays in the in the social media sphere, then it's all of the words are completely smashed together, and they are. We miss the heart of the beauty of the complexity. And so I love hearing you talk about privilege, but I'm also willing to say I've got some privileges that you don't have, right? Like that's absolutely a reality.
And I particularly because obviously I am a POC and I'm a woman, but I tell folks all the time, privilege also can change in circumstances and environments.
Sure.
So one of the conversations I have all the time with folks who are going in, particularly from the West, who may be Black, who are going to other countries is that I go, hey, you may not feel like you're privileged in the US. You're going to be hella privileged when you go to certain places like in the Middle East and other places because you have an American passport. You have a Canadian passport. You speak English. You're educated. Yeah. And so what may be seen as a privilege or as what's the opposite? As seen as oppression in one space, can be completely fluid in another space. And we all have to own that because we're never, it's always like a moving target. And so it's never the same from place to place. And I think that's the thing you learn if you allow yourself to learn it as you go from place to place, that who you are, which is why I think what you do is very relevant, is that who you are in the US may or may not apply in the same way, good or bad. That's in a China, in a Ghana, right? In a Belgium, like it may not be the same. Right. So yeah, I mean, privilege, because to me, privilege is like expat. It's a word. We all ascribe all these feelings and emotions to it, but the core of the word hasn't changed.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like the actual fundamental, what the word means, having a benefit or access, how you got it, whether you keep it, who perceives it. That's extra. Yeah. It just is. It is what it is. And so,
and it's still attached.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I'm done.
Well, I'm just it strikes me that it is also still attached when you get into all of the high tension narrative of what's unfolding, especially in the United States right now and the UK and kind of the refugee situation around the world. Like privilege is attached there, and then that gets expanded, right? Like that's the screaming narrative, and it should be. It absolutely should be. But that's where we hear the word privilege. And so when we step over here to, wow, I just have access to a lot of things that people don't, it feels like we're talking about exactly the same thing. And by definition of the word, we are, but it's in these, like you're talking about, it's in these different environments. And it takes on a completely different feel, a different meaning, there's a different heart to it. And so it's complex. It's very complex.
And so I think it's almost like, so you wrote this piece. So it's January 2020, it gets published, right? Awesome piece. It's doing its thing. And then fast forward, we get to May. And in a year that was already stressful, you obviously were in China,
right?
Like COVID. Although us
Right.
being in the US, I don't even know if we're talking about China, but the US
Right.
is figuring out something that looks like a response.
The China virus was just getting started. Yeah.
Right. We fast forward to May, and then we have what seems like a world that was already teetering and was actually on fire in some places already. And we have the murder of George Floyd. And so then you write this other piece about what do I tell my son? And the fact that you've already mentioned, you have a daughter who's of Asian descent, you have a son who is Black. And what was it like for you to sort of write that piece, and particularly as someone who does not share the same identity as your son? Where were you kind of mentally in that space?
It was a whirlwind. It was one of those moments there's a lot of insecurity that goes into being a white father raising children of color. And am I doing the right thing? Am I helping them understand their heritage? What is their heritage? Like we have limited access to where they come from, although some things we know, but also as we think about how they interact with and are going to interact with the world for the rest of their lives, are we doing enough? Are we, this is their formative time. This is the time that things are being built into them that are going to last for the rest of their lives. So are we doing enough? And so when George Floyd was murdered, my son was 10 years old at the time, and he's got a very sensitive heart. He just always has. And that comes out in a lot of different ways. But I wanted to have a conversation with him. So I remember we were sitting in a taxi, and I think I pulled something up on my phone about it. And I said, son, we need to have this talk. And I had this conversation, and his initial response was, it kind of caught me off guard because it just wasn't what I expected. His first thought was empathy for the police, because that's how it hit him. Like, the world must hate him. And I was like, yeah. And then he just kind of processed, and and I'm looking at that thinking, what do I do with that? Right? Like, am I going to set my Black son up? Is he going to jump to the white side of this? What's that going to do for him in his future? And I was just freaking out, but it was just him processing. It was just him really feeling empathy for all of the players in it. And then it sunk in, then it hit. Not only that George Floyd was killed, but that he was Black, and that my son was also Black. And I just kind of watched it sink in. And he threw a couple things out there, and it didn't get uncomfortable, but it was like he was starting to get uncomfortable with it. So I just pulled back a little bit and let him process. And then he said something about a video game, which he's 10 years old. That's what he does, right? Like, I want to get this game. And I'm like, yeah. And then he said, Dad, sometimes I just feel like everybody hates me. And I thought we had moved on. Like, I thought we had skipped over the going video game. I thought we we're just kind of processing where he's at right now. And I'm like, okay, I can empathize with that. I've been there. I'm like, yeah, son, I feel like that too. And he said, yeah, but you're not Black. And it was just like, right. Like that absolutely blew me away. And I just stopped and kind of paused in that and recognize the reality of that is that even though he is being raised in our family, even though we're in China and we're not in right in the middle of a lot of the racial issues of his passport country, there are things that he's carrying inside of him that I want him to be able to understand more. And I am not the person to unpack that for him. I am not the teacher here. I'm the learner. And so it really, my hope was, the thing that came out of that experience was this hope that I can hold that posture, that in this racial conversation, especially in the wake of George Floyd and the racial tensions that are just heightening and are just stirred up. Like they've existed for so long, and my demographic has just kind of walked through that, ignoring a lot of it and not seeing so much of it. But now the stakes are high because I'm raising this kid who I'm going to launch him out into this world. And he's got this whole piece that I do not understand and I can't understand. And as I was writing this piece, I sat down with him again and I said, buddy, I want to write this piece. And I think it could be helpful for a lot of people like me who are trying to understand and maybe don't understand. And maybe they could have some insight into how you feel. And he was like, yeah, of course, Dad. Like, I was getting his permission. He's like, of course you can write it. But Dad, he said, you can teach me about Black history. And then he said, even though I already know most of it, and he said, and you can teach me about white history, even though I already know most of that too. But he said, but you can't teach me what it feels like to be Black. And I was like, buddy, you are so absolutely right. And I want to learn from you.
Wow.
I want to hear your heart on that. And so I think in that moment and through that experience, I became a learner from my son. My son is my teacher and it's a different experience, right? He's not growing up in an underprivileged neighborhood. He doesn't have the same experience that a lot of children of color do. But he knows what it feels like to be Black. And he knows what it feels like to be Black in an expat experience and in a cross-cultural experience and all of the nuances of who he is and how he identifies and will identify are a training ground for me. And I want to come in with a posture of humility and willingness to learn about that. And there are some things that I understand about it that he doesn't understand yet. And I have a responsibility to walk with him in that and to help him see that. But I'm not the teacher of what it feels like to be Black.
And I think that's a powerful statement because, we're starting to see a number of families who have adopted Black children who are expats, who they themselves are not Black. Yeah. And which is why I appreciate your willingness to even come on and talk about some of these things, because who do you, right. I mean, you could probably speak to this. Who do you talk to if, in your case, you didn't come from an expat family, a mobile family, you came from probably pretty similar in terms of people had similar backgrounds, expectations, whatever. You decide to go international. Now you've got kids who don't look like you, who may be having different experiences for you. And I think that a lot of families who are in that position may not always necessarily know how to approach talking about race, particularly if they're coming from countries, and it isn't just the United States. I mean, there's part of the protests and riots that happened in France was due to the murder of a young man, I believe in 2018 or so, by the police. And there's been a history there, and the UK has got its own story, and the Netherlands and whatnot. But how do you, as parents, because we always talk about with Black families, the talk, there's and you, at least you understand what the talk is, the talk that Black parents have with Black children. Right. And at least in the United States. So I'm even wondering in this conversation with him, it almost seems like you're starting to have some version of the talk because
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And that's where I think through this experience, again, it's so convoluted because there are these not competing, but there are these different narratives. And growing up in China, absolutely racism exists in China. But it doesn't have the same backstory as the racism in the United States. And so we've got these two parts of his identity that are there. One of them he has been growing up in, the other one we're back to for now, and we're figuring all of that out. But to be able to recognize the challenges of that and to try to speculate and to figure out what is it that he's going to need as he grows into an adult, as he thinks about engagement with whatever cultures he engages with. like what do I need to offer him as we move forward? That's really, really challenging. And so I'm trying to take it with humility, but a lot of times I just catch myself speaking again as if I'm some type of expert on this, and I have to pull back from that, and I think letting him know that I want to be a learner, right? Like letting him know that I don't have all of the answers on this. But I do want to have him connected to people who can speak into that, who can teach him what it feels like for them to be Black, or for them to be a person of color, and of whatever that is and wherever that is, because there's so many different experiences. And I think that's one of the privileges that he has, is access to people from all over the world with a lot of different experiences. And my hope is that all of that builds this beautiful mosaic of understanding that helps him to engage the world in a way that I didn't have access to. I hope that he gets a privilege that I don't have. Yeah.
I mean, I think it would be awesome if I could ever get myself together, just this community of TCKs of color, to sort of talk through, especially my own experiences and talking to TCKs who are younger than me, but have been, 20s and 30s now, and sort of their experiences, especially when they engage with the cultures that are their passport nations, right? And just, because you're right. I think that part of it is, for all of us, it isn't just the individual, the family, but as many people who can kind of speak and understand to the uniqueness of it, I think is a support. And it's interesting to me, I graduated from high school a while ago, apparently. But even talking to TCKs now, and I'm doing all this speaking, and I'm like, how is this stuff still an issue? Like, right. 22 years later, like, especially, we're still not teaching or preparing or having these honest conversations about if these kids, for example, are international schools and they're launching back into the US or Canada, wherever they're going. We're still not talking about race. Right. We're still not talking about it like this many years later. And I'm still hearing the same challenges. And so, you're right. I don't think there's any one answer, but I do think that the fact that you approach it with humility is important. And I think that for the families who do hear this and are trying to figure out their way, I hope that that's an encouragement, because no one has the perfect answer.
Not at all. And it's such a, like, humility is such a loaded concept, right? Like humility. I'm really good at humility when I have the space and the time to stop and think and say, okay, what this situation needs here is humility, but it's not my muscle memory, right? Like it's not what comes out in the moment. We had an experience in our last weeks in China. And this was another powerful experience. I haven't written about it yet, and I may not, I don't know. It was the first time anything like this had happened in China. My son and I were taking a walk through a place that he's grown up. Like we've walked there. It was kind of a touristy area. And so lots of people out walking around. I sat down for a moment, and he ran up ahead. And this group of 3 Chinese people walked right by me, 2 men and a woman. And so there's me, there's this group, and there's my son up ahead. And they see him. And one of the guys kind of elbows his buddy, and he yells out, "Hey, Black!" And they giggle and they laugh, and I came unglued. I jumped out of my seat, and I got about 3 feet behind them and walked. I was basically breathing down their neck. My son, like, you could just see his face. And this was after the George Floyd thing. He's processing, what does all this mean? He's processing racism, but apart from the big narrative and in China, and trying to figure all of that out. So he circles back around to me, and he kind of sees me steaming, and he's like, "Dad, I kind of want to punch that guy in the face." And I said, "Yeah, he might get punched in the face." And he looks up at me, and I don't know if they speak any English. I don't know what's going on. But he looks up at me, and you could see this. And my son, who's like, I told you, like, he's a passionate kid, on all the spectrums. Like, he doesn't do anything halfway. And so if he's angry, you're going to feel it. If he's loving, you're going to feel love like you have never felt loved in your life. But he looks at me, and I just watch his entire demeanor change. And he was like, Dad, it's all right. It's all right. And so like he talked me down. And I'm a nice guy, Amanda. Like I really am. I'm not a fighter.
I've had dinner with you.
I know.
I know. I know I'm not a nice person, but I know you are. I just threatened to hit many people with a brick, so I know I'm not a nice person.
Well, I'm
yes,
thankful to not be one of those yet, unless you've done it secretly. But I don't go looking for fights. I've been in one good physical fight in my life, and it was so justified, and it was so the right thing to do. But I'm not the guy who fights. But I would have punched this guy, and I felt this rage inside of me. And I teach this stuff. Like I understand that there were different dynamics. I understand that he didn't carry with him George Floyd. Like he'd seen that in the news, but that wasn't his racism. He was just showing off for the two friends around him. He was showing off this one English word that he knew, and it was joking. So it was like, all of the volume was turned down on all of the really racial issues, but it stirred something in me and it triggered something in me that I can only describe as rage. And for me, it was this huge, huge moment of like, wow, I can see it now, because I haven't had 400 years of that cranked up 10,000 times that. Yeah. And I haven't experienced, this was a sampling. This was a tiny little taste. And it stirred something in me that I didn't like and that I didn't feel like I was in control of. And it was just like the lights went on for a moment and it was like, okay, all right. I have a lot of learning and listening to do, and there's a long way to go. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for sharing that, because you're right. I think when we see the end of something, we think it's that thing, and it doesn't matter what it is, good or bad or whatever.
Yeah, so much.
But you don't see the back history, and you don't see the story that comes with it. And so I can definitely relate to that, and just, and I think also the parental instinct as well is to always protect your child. Of course, when people come at your child, you're ready to brawl, unless you're me, who does not have children, but we'll just brawl anyway. It is what it is. But
you throw bricks.
My gosh,
I'm glad I know that now.
And I'm the calm one. Y'all haven't met my sister. My sister's that legit crazy. Y'all, because she found Jesus. Y'all don't even understand. Like, you seriously, like, don't matter whether you're religious or not, you should be thankful that my sister has Christ in her life, because she's the one who used to fight for real, all the time. Luckily, she's married to a very calm man who kind of talks her off that ledge. But my sister's the brawler. I'm the half brawler. She's the
You're the half brawler.
Older sister will fight. She'll do it for real. But oh my gosh, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you
for sharing your story and your experiences. It's always a good time to be had.
It is.
And
this has been good.
For the people who don't know, you've got this podcast, Diesel and Clooney. It's definitely going to be in the show notes. Yeah. It is hilarious. I can't even describe it. Sort of expat life, just sort of amusement all around
sort of
with Chris O'Shaughnessy.
Random thoughts about whatever comes up. Yeah.
You and Chris are a little crazy, but yeah, thank you for coming to the chatter. I might have you back on. There's always so much that we could talk about. So
anytime.
All right.
The Global Chatter with the Black Expat is hosted by me, Amanda Bates. It is produced by Justin Williams. You can find the show wherever you get your podcast or follow us on our YouTube channel at The Black Expat Presents.